Hi, welcome back to my channel. I'm back with another update to my completed Insecticons display. In my last video, I went through my process in creating the base pieces, and in this video, I'm going to go through how I created the background piece that goes with it. The main thing I wanted to achieve with this is to add some interest. Because the figures themselves are small, I wanted to make sure I'm able to really fill up the space in a better way, and since these characters actually appeared in the show in big swarms of like multiples, I thought what better way than to display them in both alt mode and as well as bot mode. So with that in mind, I decided to pick up a set of bad cubes bugs to go along with the fans toys, and that way I can display one in bug form and then the other in bot. And after deciding to do that, the next step was just to figure out what the best way is to display everything, and this is just what I came up with. So stay tuned as I go through my process in creating this display. And to start off, for this project, I'm working with two pieces of floor foam mat. I managed to get my hands on a bunch of these secondhand, so the cost was next to nothing, which is great. And what's also really nice about this material is the thickness itself. It's nice and thin, which is perfect for a project such as this. And the other thing about this material is that it has a bit of flex and give to it, which is something I plan to take advantage of because I want to create a bit of curve and bend to the background. And to get these pieces prepped, I simply just need to trim off the edges that has the jigsaw pattern to it. And I do this with a sharp utility knife. This material is really easy and straightforward to use. My main tip is to make sure that you have a really sharp cutting edge. This foam can dull a blade pretty quickly, so making sure that you have a constantly sharpened blade is really essential to getting clean cuts. So with every 2 or 3 cuts I make, I'm going back and I'm using my sharpener to make sure that my blade is always sharp. And with these first couple of initial cuts, I'm just starting to work out the general shape and pattern of my main background. The idea here is that with each piece I cut out, I'm going back and shifting and staggering the alignment of it slightly and then gluing it back on. And the idea here is that this creates the look of actual separate panels that you can visually see, because there's actually slight differences in the depth, and I kind of like that look, and it just makes the general background a little more interesting. And with each piece of foam that I cut out, right before I go ahead and glue it back on, I make sure that I'm sanding the edges so that it has more of a finished look to it. And when working with this type of foam, I find super glue works best. It has a really strong hold, and it also adheres pretty quickly. So this way I can quickly build up piece by piece, and then as I'm working I can just continue to add until I get it to the general shape and size that I want. For this piece, the plan was always to give the whole thing a slight curve to it. That's one of the reasons why I opted to use this type of foam in the first place. I'm able to flex and bend the foam without it tearing. The main challenge here is not necessarily getting it into that right shape and that right bend, but it's to actually keep it there. And to solve this, the plan is to simply glue a support behind the background itself. That would just give it some tension and actually hold it in place. And here's what I have so far. I have the general shape already in place, and so I thought it was a good time to give it a quick test fit. My goal here is to rely solely on friction to keep it in place, so I want to make sure that the height was just right. I didn't want it to be too loose, especially since I was planning to hang heavy figures on it, so I wanted to ensure that it was a nice snug fit, again taking advantage of the flex and bend of the foam. And while I had the piece in place, I decided to use the opportunity to go ahead and plot where the figures would go in the display, especially for Bombshell, which I plan to have coming out of the wall itself. So that took a little more planning just to figure out exactly where that hole would go. And with that out of the way, I can now move on to the detailing phase, which is always the most fun. For this piece, I wanted to create a lot of holes and bite marks everywhere because I wanted the whole thing to look a bit battered and worn. So basically that just meant I had to go to town on it and just start picking and cutting up parts of the foam. And as I'm doing this, I just want to make sure that I'm varying my marks so they look random and chaotic. So that meant I just had to vary my approach from the tools I'm using as well as the way I'm making my marks. And for detailing such as adding additional panel lines, it's pretty simple. You simply just score the foam with a knife. Later on you can go back over it with a heat gun, and the heat will cause the seams to expand, making them more pronounced. And you can create the lines using the aid of a ruler if you think you need it, or you can freehand it if you feel confident. And since I had previously roughed in where the big hole Bombshell would be coming out of, I already had a good idea of how big the hole needed to be, so now it's just a matter of cutting it out. As I'm doing this, I just want to make sure that the cuts I'm making are rough and jagged, since I want it to resemble bite marks. And as I expand the hole, I'm also going back and checking every once in a while just to see how the figure is going to actually fit into the hole. So another neat trick I like to use with this foam to make it look like metal is being bent or twisted is to insert a piece of metal wire into the foam itself. In this case I'm using a paper clip, and what the metal wire does is it gives the foam more rigidity, essentially acting like an armature. So now when I go to bend it, the foam actually keeps its shape. And I do this in several spots throughout the piece, anywhere where I really want it to look distressed or I want the metal to look like it's twisted and gnarled. And here's the piece again after it's been fully detailed. Plenty of wear and tear throughout, and it looks pretty beat up, which is exactly what I was going for. Because this backdrop is a little more elaborate than my others, at this stage I wanted to work out where all the figures would go before I actually moved on to paint. I tossed around some ideas on how I could suspend the other two bugs on the wall, and in the end I settled on using some wire. At first I attached the wire to the figure itself. Lucky for me, these figures have some really easy areas for me to wrap the wire around and to secure, and without it being visible. And once that part was done, I then threaded the other end of the wire through a hole I made in the foam. And on the back side, I then anchored that down to some Lego pieces I had glued on the foam itself. And with that out of the way, I once again did another test fit, but this time with all the figures in place. After seeing it up together like this was quite a relief. Going into this project, getting the figures in place the way I envisioned was always the most challenging part. So now that I've crossed that hurdle and seeing that I'm pretty happy with the direction it was going, I now felt comfortable moving on to paint. And to start off, I lay down a coat of primer. The color I'm using is a dark gray here, and the paint I'm using is water-based latex house paint that I purchased from the hardware store. I generally just use one coat over the entire surface, and then once that's dried, I then go back and make a second pass for any touch-ups or any spots that I may have missed. And once that's dried, I can now move on to the top colors. The color scheme I'm using for this background piece is the same for the bases, so I'm using 2 shades of purple. And to apply, I usually just start with one color, let that dry, and then apply the second. I'm arbitrarily picking out which panels are which color. The main thing for me is that I generally like the lighter purple to make up the main color of the piece, while the darker shade acts more of as an accent here and there, just to kind of break up the surface and to add a little more interest and contrast. And I'll switch back and forth until I have 2 coats on everything. And the next part comes some weathering to give the whole surface a more realistic look. To achieve this, I am simply laying down a wash of watered down dark gray and brown acrylic paint. Once I have applied the wash throughout, I go back and then wipe off certain areas and leave certain areas darker where you would expect dirt and grime to collect. And this kind of adds a little more of a realistic look to it. And this step is followed by some final detailing with a bit of line work with a black brush pen to bring out some of the panel lines, followed by some silver paint to bring out some of the highlights in the metal. And this pretty much wraps up the painting phase of this project. All that's left to do now is to add the moss. And for this I'm using the same technique I used with the bases. I start off by mixing in my colors. For this I'm using tube acrylics, a bit of blue as well as some yellow to give me a nice green color. And to this mixture I'm adding a bit of water and some wood or PVA glue. And once I have this all mixed together and it's at a consistency that I like, then I add the dryer lint. And this is lint that actually gives me the texture that I want. And I want to just continue mixing this until the color is thoroughly incorporated into the lint. And then it's just a matter of applying this mixture onto the piece itself. And as I'm doing this, I'm thinking about the areas where I would think the moss would naturally grow. And once I'm done with this, we have to let it dry overnight until it's thoroughly dry. And here we have the finished background piece. All in all, I think this project turned out a lot better than I had originally expected. What I really like about it was how I was able to really play off these characters and what they were all about, and then incorporate that into the display. And the best part is having the background interact with the figures as well. I feel like that was a really nice touch to be able to tie everything together. Well, I'm happy I was able to share this with everyone, and I hope my work will inspire you to create something for your collection as well. As always, thank you for watching. Please comment, like, and subscribe for more content. Till next time.